Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. Thank you for joining us today on this beautiful sunny Friday on a very not live episode, which is a change for us in the last few weeks. So good listeners of Podcast Land, thank you for downloading our podcast and for staying apprised of Oklahoma politics. I'm joined, we've got a barn burner of a show for you today because it's been a barn burner of a week. Specifically, Monday was just packed with information and stuff going on. And we're going to talk through as much as we can get through in the next 45 to 55 minutes. Joining me today, of course, is Bailey Perkins. Hello, Bailey.
Hello, Andy.
And Scott Melson. Hello, sir.
What is up, man? How are you?
I'm well. Scott, I will be honest, I'm still on an emotional high following our watching of the new West Wing episode last night. It's not new, but it was a new episode of a bunch of older folks on stage reading scripts from 20 years ago, right? That's basically...
Is it weird that I want to watch it again tonight?
No, I'm with you. I may have to sign up for a free trial of HBO Max just to watch it again. It was very good. It
was everything that I wanted it to be, and it like makes me so happy to see that Martin Sheen at however old he is, like, man, he still got it, you know. And you know what? If he can still act like a president, then like surely someone could still be president at that age, right? Like,
well, either way, we will. I don't know how old Martin Sheen is, but either way, our president will be one of, if not the oldest president to be elected. I will say
Martin Sheen is 80 years young.
So how old's Biden? 77?
Biden is 77 and President Trump is 74, I believe.
Birds of a feather there. I think the highlight for me, honestly, of the show, it was great, but I really liked the intro music with W. Snuffy Walden playing the intro on the guitar. Like, that was just the vibe was cool, and it set the tone for the show. And as you very astutely pointed out during our watching, that's how he wrote it in the first place, right? It was on the guitar.
Yeah. Which is like just super cool when you think about like that. At least what I think of as a pretty like iconic orchestration of that opening, the opening credits, and then you hear it on an acoustic guitar, which is how Snuffy wrote it. It's like, it's just so cool to hear it that way.
Is it weird if I ask you guys to only refer to me as Snuffy from now on? Is that a
no? I'm on board.
All right.
You should change your screen name on the right here on the StreamYard. You should just instead of Andy Moore, just Snuffy.
Right. What if my Twitter was at Snuffy OKC?
You should totally do that. If you don't, I'm going to.
Well, it's too much work. It's too. A former employer of mine has been going through a rebrand this week, and none of their screen names match their new company name now, which is funny to me. But
how you want it, right?
That's right. That's how you want it. All right. So I'm going to read a series of headlines real quick that I think all happened on Monday, except for the last one, and then we'll go back to the beginning and talk through them. But this week in Oklahoma politics, Representative Ryan Martinez from Edmond announced plans to file legislation to block the governor's plan to move the public health lab from Oklahoma City to Stillwater. Numerous legislators have voiced opposition to the governor's plan to privatize Medicaid. The governor appointed former Senate Pro Tem Brian Bingman as his new Secretary of State, and in the same press release accepted the resignation of his Finance Secretary, Mike Mazzei. Attorney General Mike Hunter assigned special counsel to investigate Epic charter schools. The State Board of Education is giving Epic only 60 days to pay back $11 million. The statewide virtual charter school board began the process of terminating their contract with Epic. All of that happened on Monday in about 4 hours. And then later in the week, the governor, like yesterday, I think the governor formally appointed 3 state agency directors and that were interims, and now they're official full-timers or permanent. And then we'll note this, but I think we're going to hold off on talking about it and that something is whatever the hell is going on with Oklahoma County government. We've referenced this, I think, in a few episodes. And next week, like, let's for real talk about it. I will make an outline of a timeline of the last, I don't know, 12, 18 months of what's happened over there. But earlier this week, it started out with Commissioner Kevin Calvey. Last week or this week, it filed a lawsuit on behalf of the Board of County Commissioners and the Oklahoma Second Amendment organization. It was the county commissioners suing the jail trust. And so because of that, Commissioner Calvey was the defendant, the petitioner, and the attorney of record. So he was suing himself, and he was the attorney representing himself in suing himself, which I don't think you can do. And yesterday, the district attorney just threw it out, right? Or,
well, so he didn't throw it out. He filed a motion to intervene, basically saying, "Hello, actually, I am the district attorney, and the only person who can represent like the board of county commissioners is the DA. Like, and you can't have a like
he's the official attorney for Oklahoma County.
Right. Like, you can't just be like, I am suing the jail trust on behalf of the county, like, as a private citizen. Like, DA Prater is saying like that's not allowed. And for, I am, as we've said many times on the podcast, not a lawyer. But when this came out, I like this came up on my Twitter feed. And I mean, I think within 30 seconds, I had a text from a local attorney who was like, no. Right. You can't be both plaintiff, defendant, and attorney of record. Like, you can't do all the things.
You can if you're at home playing school by yourself in your backyard, right? Like, that's this is like what my son does, where he's like, I'm gonna be the referee and the player, and whatever else. I'm like, okay, it's like Calvin and Hobbes. It's like Calvin ball.
But you know what they say about local government, right? It's like the laboratory for democracy. And so, I mean, it was an interesting attempt for an experiment.
That's exactly right. And, in an alternate timeline, the district attorney might not have stepped in. And then what would have happened, right? We would just let this happen. Anyway, we'll come back to that.
That would have been really weird precedent to set.
Yeah, surely something else would have happened, but we will come back to that later. Let's start with the public health story. So the public health lab. I'll set it up, and then Scott, I'll kick it to you first. So I think we may have mentioned this last week that the governor announced his plans to build the Oklahoma Pandemic Center and Travel Stop or something in Stillwater, right? There's a Center for Excellence and Innovation.
Are you saying Travel Stop?
Yeah, I'm being snarky because
the Derek Zoolander Center for kids who can't read good and want to learn how to do other stuff good too.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Oh man, that joke gets me every time. I have a bias against people who use the words innovation and excellence. Not just the governor, anybody who throws the word innovation around all the time drives me bananas. But I digress. Scott, tell us a little bit about what he proposed and what the opposition is to this proposal.
Yeah. So essentially what he wants to do is move the public health laboratory from where it's currently located at the State Department of Health on the Oklahoma Health Sciences Center campus. And he wants to move it to the OSU campus in Stillwater, which is kind of an interesting thing. So the first thing to understand is like, what is the public health laboratory? So the public health laboratory it's the center in Oklahoma where like our infectious disease kind of testing and monitoring, all that stuff takes place, right? So like you're talking about like coronavirus testing in the early days of the pandemic, like that's where the testing was being done. When samples, if there's someone who is suspicion for another like, rare but communicable disease, sometimes those samples are sent to the public health laboratory. This is where tests get developed. They do all kinds of stuff. one thing to know about our public health laboratory is that for a while it's really been in not great shape. So a few years ago, it was actually at risk of losing its accreditation. That would have been something that required it to close if it lost accreditation. Lots of folks at multiple levels of state and state government have been saying for years that like this is something that we need to address, right? That we need to put some more investment into our public health laboratory. So the idea of taking some money and putting money into the public health laboratory is not like a weird thing. The thing though that has a lot of people kind of going, what? Like, does this make sense? Is the idea of putting the public health laboratory in Stillwater. Now, this is not an OU-OSU thing. This is nothing against Stillwater. But the public health laboratory right now, where it's located, it's minutes from I-35, it's minutes from I-40, it's minutes from I-44, it's near a major airport. Like, it's the central location of the public health laboratory is one of the things that allows it to serve the entire state, right?
And it's near the Department of Health.
And it's near the Department of Health, yes, right? Like, and so that's one reason why it is where it is. And so the idea of moving it to Stillwater, which for better or for worse is, even though it is Stillwater obviously has a major university, Oklahoma State is a major research university. Like it has nothing to do with the fact that it's like, OSU. It's the fact that it's in a rural community that doesn't have those things, right? Like you don't have easy access to a major highway. You're 45 minutes off I-35 and, significantly farther from any other major transit. There is an airport in Stillwater, but it's a regional airport. It's not an airport that like serves, the whole country the way that like Will Rogers Airport here in Oklahoma City is. It's also not centrally located. And it's also not near all the other state services and the other kind of medical services that you need to really effectively run a public health laboratory. Now, the governor said that one of the reasons he was going to move it to Stillwater is because, and this is not untrue, one of the things that, and this surprises people, that the public health laboratory is engaged in, particularly in a state like Oklahoma that has a large agricultural sector, is like monitoring and dealing with disease outbreaks among animals, right? So, cattle would be probably the biggest one. And so the governor was saying by putting it in a more rural location, it would better facilitate that. I'm not enough of an expert on that kind of like epidemiology to I'm not an expert on any kind of epidemiology, but I'm specifically not an expert on that kind of epidemiology to know if like being in a more rural location would make that much sense. If you were going to move it anywhere, I would think that moving it to like the Oklahoma State Health Sciences Center campus in Tulsa, which is the OSU medical complex in Tulsa, like that would make more sense. But again, you're getting away from the central location, which is one of the things that allows the laboratory to do its job. Dr. Ed Rhodes, who was at the Oklahoma State Department of Health for like 40 years. He was the chief medical officer. He recently retired. He actually, this was on Facebook, but he wrote a pretty lengthy and I thought really insightful post about why he felt like this was really, really not a good idea. And if there's anybody who would know, it is Dr. Rhodes, because this was kind of like his deal. Another thing, you're talking about like dozens and dozens of employees, some of them with decades of experience, who live in the Oklahoma City metro, who either have to quit their jobs or move. So that's one thing, right? We've also talked about the location just not being centrally located, having easy access to transit would be another. Another thing is facilities, right? You can't just open up a public health laboratory or any kind of laboratory in like an empty warehouse, right? Like you have to have very specific construction materials. The building has to be constructed under very stringent specifications. Like you can't move anywhere.
Guidelines, right?
Yeah, it's got to meet federal guidelines. It depending on what kind of materials you're going to work with. I mean, like just look at the coronavirus outbreak, right? Like one of the things that is not true, but was rumored at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak is that where this came from was a lab in Wuhan, China, that was working with materials that they weren't graded to work with. I want to emphasize there's no evidence that that's the case, but you can't just like handle certain like really communicable diseases in a regular laboratory. You have to have certain kinds of facilities and safeguards and protections. And so you have to like kind of build this custom facility, right? So
and Scott, there's an expense to sustain it over time too.
Oh yeah, right. Like this, yeah. I mean, so it's and then lastly, there's it's not at all clear. Representative Emily Virgin, or I should say Leader Virgin, who's the leader of the Democrats in the House, she wrote this week, it is not even clear that the governor has like the authority to do this, like that he can just be like, oh, hey, I've decided like we're moving the public health lab. Representative Martinez, who represents Edmond, has actually filed legislation to say that like to prohibit this and say that make it explicit that the governor doesn't have that authority. And then lastly, he wants to finance this using like $24 million of CARES Act funds. And I mean, I don't know. I'm just throwing out there, since we have record hospitalizations, record ICU admissions, and record case numbers, it seems like maybe we could spend the $24 million on something else related to the actual pandemic. But, you know, that's just me. Well,
didn't also, like, the governor said he plans to have it moved by the end of the year, which is, if you had to move your house before the end of the year, like, that's not a small task, right? Much less the public health laboratory.
Yeah, like yeah.
To Scott's point, there's certain aspects that take time to craft and make sure that it's meeting federal regulations.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's almost like blinking your eyes and making something happen, which is nearly impossible for this type of complicated project to build from scratch.
I mean, inspections, right? Like that. If you're going to build a house in the next 2 months, unless you are Extreme Home Makeover and you've got things squared away well in advance, it's not going to happen, much less a public health laboratory. And also, I will take umbrage on a small personal level.
I love it when people take umbrage.
The press release about it. First of all, there's no debate that we need a new public health lab, right? Like, it is old and out of date, and the health department is moving to a new building like this week, and that's also much needed. But
some of the equipment is like 40, 50 years old. So, and the building itself is probably way older than that.
Yeah, I have some really good photos. I was looking back through my Instagram this week, actually, at photos I had taken in the health department building of, like, there's in the basement. I used to have to take blood samples to the public health laboratory for HIV confirmatory testing. I would walk them over there from our office, and then you drop them off. You go around to the back to the loading dock, and you go in through that back door, and you go to the public health like window, and then this metal cart outside with a piece of paper taped to it that says rabies cart, do not remove. It's just like, you're like, oh, okay. So you put dead animals here, right? Then you wheel them around. Nice.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, no one is arguing that the current state of the public health lab is like good or acceptable.
Right. But anyway, the governor's press release was like, we are going to build this to prepare for the next pandemic. And I just could hear the public screaming, what about the current pandemic, right? Like, this lab does not help us meet the needs that we have today of the people that are dying today and our state's response. And the CARES dollars are ideally designed to address the current pandemic. And if it happens to help us prepare for the future, yes, but like, it was maybe it's just an issue with messaging. I don't know, but it just felt a little misguided to me.
Well, and it's also like this, we're going to create this center for like excellence in pandemic management. I mean, I guess, one question I had was, okay, well, when you create the center and they make recommendations in the next pandemic, like issuing a statewide mask mandate, are you going to listen to those? Or are you going to blow those off too? Like, right. Are you going to listen to the excellence in pandemic center? Like, are you going to treat them the way that you treat the current recommendations, or do you know what I mean? Like, it just reeks of such cognitive dissonance. It's like, do you really believe that we are leading the way in how we respond to this?
Right.
Like has Oklahoma done something that makes you think that we're like the gold standard in responding to COVID? Like,
well, I also wanted to add to your point, Scott, about whether the governor even has the authority to make this unilateral move. Because our listeners can remember back to March. Yeah, it was the end of March where we were having discussions on CHIPA, right? And he had authority back then to make the decisions on behalf of the state in a unilateral way on where funding was going to go and different things. But our legislature didn't extend that power after May. And so that is an interesting question on the legalities of him being able to say, we're going to create this entity and this is what we're going to do with the money without legislative input.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like the governor, maybe we should give Governor Stitt the benefit of the doubt. It's not like he has a track record of doing things unilaterally and then later finding out he doesn't have the authority to do that at all. I mean, it's not like he makes random decisions and then gets taken to court and, loses nearly every time. So maybe he deserves the benefit of the doubt.
All right.
That's his sarcasm for new listeners. So
there's lots of air quotes going on. You just can't see them. Well, speaking of pushback against plans the governor's had, I still do feel bad for the governor because he's had a lot of big ideas that have just fallen flat or been met with very stiff resistance from other members of the legislature, most notably. And so the other thing that's on the similar vein is, we are moving closer. We have expanded Medicaid. And the governor, true to his word, followed through with his plans to privatize Medicaid, right? To move to a managed care system, which Oklahoma has tried to do many, many, many times over the last 20 years. And it has fallen through, stopped, or been only partially implemented almost every time. But recently they put out a request for proposal, RFP, for managed care companies to apply for this. But apparently the governor did this unilaterally and did not run it by or through the legislature first.
And Andy, it's a rarity that you see both chambers speaking in unison on an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And on this particular one, you have the leaders of the public health committees and the healthcare committees raising concern from both the House and the Senate. So that's very interesting that A, he left out the legislature, but B, you have both chambers saying, I don't know about this.
Right. Yeah. It was so Representative Marcus McIntyre, who was on the program 2 weeks ago, and Senator Greg McCourtney, who's also a friend of the pod, both had statements in the Oklahoman Story about this. And also Senator Standridge from down in Norman had some pretty strong words where he was like, in Senator Standridge's opinion, managed care is a bad idea, which I thought was a stark statement from a pretty, middle of the road conservative. My impression of Standridge is that he is a bit of a budget hawk, and yeah, he's a pharmacist also. So I think he has like a different level of understanding of this process.
Well, and I think that makes his thought process even more unique about managed care, because fiscal hawks typically lean to managed care from the perspective that it's supposed to have all of these immediate cost savings in healthcare. However, when you're capping the amount of money that can be spent per patient within a healthcare system, the big concern is there going to be the need for cost on the back end, after certain procedures are skipped or medications are skimmed or whatever, for a managed care health system. And so it's really interesting that as a person who is a fiscal conservative, for him to say that this isn't going to lead into the cost savings that we expect, because you can't just say, we're only going to spend this much on your medications and we're only going to cover certain services to give people the adequate care that they need. So there's a continuous theme of, will this lead to quality healthcare services, or will it lead to furthering a current problem?
Mm-hmm.
This is one of those deals where, it's like, look, I am not an anti-market guy, right? Like, I think markets are, in many cases, not every case, but in many cases, the best way to efficiently allocate like goods and services and set prices. So like markets have an important role to play, but you can like worship at the altar of the like free market too much, right? And this isn't even really that's not even the right way to say it. This is worshiping at the altar of like business, right? That gives somebody a profit incentive and it always makes things better. So we haven't actually said like what managed care is. Right. So right now, if you have Medicaid Sooner Care, right, like it's your insurance, you go see a doctor, you get a prescription, that provider bills Medicaid reimburses the provider, and that's there's no middleman, right? Managed care would insert a middleman where if you're on Sooner Care, rather than getting service, like rather than going directly through like the state, like you would go through an insurance company, essentially a managed care organization, and the state would pay that organization a fixed cost to cover the cost of your health care, right? And then that organization would then enter into contracts with, drug makers, doctors, whoever, to provide you with health care. And the idea is that, like, let's say that, the state of Oklahoma pays that managed care organization $5,000 a year to cover your healthcare costs. If they can get you healthcare for less than $5,000, they keep the rest, right? But if it costs more than $5,000, they have to eat the difference, right? And that's how they make money. So their incentive is to provide healthcare for their beneficiaries for less than what they're being paid by the state. So they have incentive to cover fewer services. They have an incentive to pay lower rates, which then makes providers less likely to enter into contracts, right?
And the same thing applies to medications, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's an incentive to even not approve a certain medication because it could cost too much and not fit within this fixed rate.
Right. And the idea is that the idea here is and this is like the kind of, worshiping at the altar of business wet dream. Like the idea is that by letting a private company do this rather than the state of Oklahoma doing this, you're like automatically gaining efficiency because they're automatically more efficient because they're a private company and they're business people. And so that means they're more efficient. I mean, and that might make sense if Oklahoma had really, really high Medicaid administrative costs, but we don't. We actually have one of the lowest administrative costs in the country, right? So there's not like a ton of savings to be gleaned there, right? Andy, you look like you're going to say something.
Well, I was going to say by adding in a layer to this, you are adding in administrative costs.
Yeah, right. Like you're adding an additional layer of bureaucracy, which I feel like the governor's talked about the need to minimize bureaucracy. I don't know why we would add a layer here, but
because
that's like what you're
private.
doing. Right?
Private bureaucracy.
Private bureaucracy is a private bureaucracy doesn't count, right? Like if you look at Oklahoma, our Medicaid administrative cost is about 3.7% of expenses. That was in 2019, and that's well below the national average. And if you look at our cost per enrollee in 2017, Oklahoma's cost per Medicaid enrollee was $6,852, which is lower than Kansas, Missouri, and Texas, right? Do you want to know one big difference between Oklahoma and Kansas, Missouri, and Texas? No one? No guesses?
What?
Our costs are significantly lower, and all three of those states use managed care, and it costs them more money, right? If you took their average cost of $8,957, like if Oklahoma's costs by using managed care were to increase to the regional average of the surrounding states who all use managed care, any idea how much Sooner Care would cost the state? How much more?
How much?
$853 million.
Wow.
Right?
Almost a bill.
Right? So, and I feel like from the discussions that we've had, we don't have an extra $1 billion laying around. The other thing is a lot of the folks that are on Sooner Care in Oklahoma live in rural areas, and managed care has traditionally proven very difficult to implement in rural areas for a lot of reasons. Oklahoma Policy Institute has a fantastic article on this. We can drop it in the show notes that you should take a look at that dives into this in a lot of details. But I think it's telling that I haven't seen anyone, including leaders of the relevant committees from the governor's own party in both chambers, to your point, Bailey, who has come out and said that this is a good idea.
Well, and Scott, like the population we're talking about are folks who are more likely to have heightened health needs, right? So if we're talking about people who may not have gone to the doctor in years and have allowed things to fester because they couldn't afford to see a doctor before, or they have some type of ailment because of not having the resources to have an adequate diet or to not be as mobile. We're talking about those who are already going to have the highest risk factors. And
Right.
so if we were talking about managed care for the everyday, like healthier person who was wealthier, that'd be one thing. But the population we're talking about will already have a high cost. Because I think they even talked about later adding in those who have a disability or some type of long-term ailment. And so the costs are just going to naturally be high inevitably because of the population we're talking about. And so in theory, managed care, you know, helps to shape costs, but the reality is it's just expensive to take care of people on the back end when we really need to make sure that people have the resources to eat healthy food, to be able to be more mobile and other things, so that way the cost for Medicaid won't be as high.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that sounds awesome, but isn't.
And so I will encourage listeners to read the story in the Oklahoman. It is not behind the paywall now, and we will link to it in the show notes for this episode. It is it's a pretty lengthy, not like a long form, but like a very thorough article that lays out the case for, the case against, what happens in other states, and explains a lot about managed care, and has some quotes from, I mean, a number of people in the legislature. It's a really good article that I think gives a well-rounded understanding of the issue. All right, well, let's move
and Andy,
on.
I just thought about what I was trying to say at the end of what I was trying to what I was saying earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I think instead of a focus on managed care, I think the focus should be on addressing poverty. So when we address poverty, then we won't have to worry about reducing that cost of Medicaid through the lens of managed care on the front end. So, but anyways, that's just my 2 cents on it.
No, I think you're exactly right. I have long said that, like, and the data bears this out, that there's almost no Medicaid fraud on the patient end, right? Like there is some on the provider end. That's a whole different story.
Yeah. The vast majority of Medicaid fraud is by doctors and hospitals, because
the system is set up to make it somewhat easy for them to do that. Not super easy, but there's an incentive there for them to make more money, right? But for patients, there's not an incentive for patients. The Medicaid system is hard enough to navigate as it is, and to like stay on it. And from someone who, you know, ran a medical clinic for more than 10 years, like you are, and prior to that was a Medicaid billing provider when I was doing mental health counseling. Like patients are constantly being kicked off Medicaid and having to get back on. And it makes that alone makes the administrative burden much higher, right? It requires more staff to be continually monitoring people's Medicaid status to make sure that they are still eligible and still approved so that you can get billed. And it just gums up the whole system. So I could really go on for probably 2 hours of just a rant about Medicaid and how its current system already is difficult, and that adding managed care would make it more difficult. But
yes, sir.
I won't, not today. So, and a non-contentious bit of news also involving the governor. As we said, he appointed former Senate Pro Tem Brian Bingman as his new Secretary of State, and also his Secretary of Finance, Mike Mazzei, resigned. That was not wholly unexpected. As we've said previously on the podcast, 2 years into the governor's term, it's expected that a number of members of his cabinet would be turning over. 2 years in a high pressure role like this, it's pretty common for them to cycle out and for new folks to come in. And I don't know that he's announced a new finance secretary, but I think this is a big grab, right? So Brian Bingman was a well-respected member of the legislature when he was pro tem. He has those kinds of relationships with the legislature and with the tribes that the governor needs. And he will be stepping in to fulfill the duties previously held by Michael Rogers, who also was a member of the legislature prior to his role as Secretary of State. It's a very different role than what we think of Secretary of State at the federal level, where it's primarily dealing with other nation states, right? Like that happens some here, which I think is probably the coolest part of the job, to be the Oklahoma Secretary of State and get to interface with international politicians. But they also do a lot of just intrastate negotiations with the legislature and with those other sovereign nations we have here in our state, like the tribes.
And they have involvement with some election things for like verification of signatures and different things. So it's almost like a hodgepodge of responsibilities for our Secretary of State.
Yeah, they do all the business filing. So if you are starting a business or a nonprofit, you file all that stuff through the Secretary of State. Their website is really interesting. I've spent time on there from, both sides, starting businesses. And then certainly when I was running, or I still am, but during the height of People Not Politicians, we would talk to them frequently, dealing with signature collection and all of that. So it's a very interesting office. I've asked some former members of the legislature if they could have any job in state government, what would it be? And almost everyone has said Secretary of State, which I think is very interesting.
Not the light gov?
No, they said
well, you
that
don't
was
have
maybe
to run as Secretary of State.
Right.
You're appointed.
Oh, that's
And
true.
you have
But
a lot of
like
authority and power for an appointed role.
light gov seems like it'd be pretty great.
Yeah, I think they both seem like good gigs, right? So yeah, the light gov, you're just campaigning for 4 years so that you can run for governor is the joke, at least, that everyone makes. So, well, our hats off to Secretary of State Brian Bingman. Good luck in your new role. I'm
Well, and
confident.
hopefully in this go around with the governor filling these new positions, that he'll find individual people to serve in those roles. I'm just not sure, was Secretary Rogers overwhelmed with the responsibilities of being an advisor and Secretary of State and Native American Affairs Secretary? And I think at one point he was an Education Secretary, right? And so he had a lot of responsibilities in one administration. And so hopefully now Secretary Bingman won't have all of those different responsibilities and he could just focus on being Secretary of State.
Yeah. I think he is also, I think he's picking up some of those other duties, but I don't know. I guess we'll find out. All right. Well, let's maybe spend the next 15 minutes or so, kind of the rest of the episode, talking about Epic. But first, before we go on to Epic, we'll end with Epic. But first, we mentioned earlier 3 previously interim state agency directors have now been made permanent, right? So they are the Oklahoma Department of Juvenile Affairs, Rachel Holt, who is the wife of Oklahoma City Mayor David Holt.
And she's been working with the agency for a long time. I think before she was their general counsel and has been interim executive director, now the official exec. So
yeah, and I think she's a tremendous asset over there. Everyone and everything I've seen, everyone's like, was super excited about her being named interim director, and I think it was kind of just assumed she would be made permanent, so that's good. Also, Lance Frye at the State Department of Health, who that's been a revolving door to some extent. The previous interim director was not confirmed by the Senate because he lacked the academic credentials that was required?
That is correct, yes.
So it's Lieutenant Colonel Lance Frye?
It was a degree that he didn't have.
Yeah.
Yeah, you gotta have an advanced degree in public health or a doctor of medicine or a doctor of osteopathic medicine.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so Dr. Frye what's his rank? Is it Lieutenant Colonel? Am I thinking of that? Okay, so
correct.
His credentials he received through the military, and so he meets all the standards.
He seems like a straight shooter. So he is now officially the director of the Department of Health, and then Carrie Sutton.
He is a physician by training.
Right. Yes. Right. And then Carrie Sutton-Hodges at the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. I don't know anything about her. I knew Terry White fairly well.
Well, and she was second in command under Terry White. And so
Really?
she's another person who's a standing staple in the mental health arena. And so having her appointed as the director of that agency is definitely a good thing because she has that institutional knowledge of the department.
Nice.
That's good to hear because I really liked Terry White and I was really displeased that she didn't, that the governor did not retain her. I feel like she did a great job there.
Well, we haven't heard much or anything from Miss Sutton-Hodges, so I'm looking forward to working with them and finding out more. Okay. On that note, then, so we had a number of headlines concerning Epic charter schools this week, all kind of around the same thing, right? So as I think listeners probably know, Epic is the largest charter school in the state. They receive a ton of money from the state and a ton more this year because everyone's gone virtual. I know a bunch of people that have put their kids in Epic this year. And there was an audit of Epic's funding. And it came out that basically the state auditor, Inspector General, Cindy Byrd, said Epic incorrectly received or spent $11 million a couple of different ways. And so the State Board of Education met on Monday, I think, and voted to give Epic 60 days to pay back that $11 million. And then
Andy, it's a range of things that they say that Epic spent the money on. And so in Auditor Byrd's findings, she mentioned that there was money spent on teachers who teach for Epic that are teaching kids in California, that some of the dollars went towards like advertising for their expansion into another state. And so it's just really, what word do I want to use? It's fascinating right now to read all of the loopholes that they were able to utilize these funds to do, because I think the biggest challenge you're seeing is that what they did wasn't necessarily illegal either, because there's not a lot of clarity in how the law is written on the ways that they spent the money.
Yeah. That's so many things like this in government are indeed fascinating. That it's like, well, this doesn't seem to be legal. I don't think it's also illegal, but it just seems sketchy. Let's ask for the money back. And Epic, of course, has pushed back, and they've said, hey, we want to see the data. Let's see what the audit, we want to see the documents that the auditor's looking at, and we want to check their math, basically. And they believe that their math will come out differently, which is concerning if that's the case. I mean, I think we all expect that Epic's going to come back and say, oh, no, we only really owe you back like $4 million.
Our audit found $7.
That's right. Yeah.
With I've got a tenner, but I'm going to need $3 change.
That's right.
But the most fascinating part to me was also the news about the appointment to the state charter.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, dude, this is all crazy.
I forgot all about that, Bailey.
Yes. There was a family member. Go ahead, Andy.
No, I was going to say the statewide virtual charter school board. So they met the following day and voted the process to begin terminating the contract that the board has with Epic. And there was one no vote. One person that voted no. And it came out that person is the aunt of the CEO of Epic. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yes.
Which seems like a conflict of interest.
Well, and Carmen from the Oklahoman and maybe a few other journalists did some further digging on it to find out that although she's saying, oh, he's a distant relative, we're not close, she had Facebook posts to him saying, happy birthday, Auntie loves you, I'm sending you a card in the mail and all these other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But they're trying to make it seem like there's no conflict of interest because there's distance, although there is a linkage because she's like his grandmother's half sister or something.
Yeah,
And
it's
so
like a
there
great
is
aunt.
a
Yeah.
close relationship.
Happy birthday, Auntie loves you. I'm sending you a card. There's $11 million inside. Don't spend it all. Don't spend it all in one place. One of those cards that has a little sleeve for the money, right? But
Yeah.
like it's 11 million instead of like 5.
Yeah, it's a really thick. It's like a brick.
It's just wild that like you're trying to make this argument that like, oh, there's no conflict of interest when there's clearly evidence.
Oh, we lost Bailey all of a sudden. Well, to finish Bailey's thought is when there's clearly evidence that they are related. And I will say, if you're on Facebook, you're probably friends with some distant relatives, and they may wish you happy birthday on occasion, right? Like I have both of my great aunts I think I'm friends with on Facebook, and if they might write happy birthday, but we don't in our family personally send cards that distance, but to each family their own, right? And regardless, there's a familiar relationship there, right? Like maybe it is distant enough that they felt comfortable with it, but in the eyes of the public,
But it's illegal.
yeah.
Because and that was the interesting piece, is that the speaker's office realized that they didn't know that connection was there.
Right.
So that's what they're claiming, is that they didn't know that relationship is there. They're going to do some investigations to see what to do as next steps, because that they mentioned that when people are nominated, they hope that they would disclose any conflict of interest,
Right.
or would step down and acknowledge that. And so it's a really interesting situation to where our state government is going to have to do a better job of doing that research and digging, and not assuming good intent and best will of folks for moments like this.
Here's a proposal. Maybe instead of using those resources to try and kick people off Medicaid, we could use those resources to make sure that when people are appointed to state boards by our elected leaders, that they don't have conflict. Like, we should flip around the honor system, right? We should let people have health insurance on the honor system, but not let them serve on a state board overseeing tens of millions of dollars. Maybe not do that on the honor system.
Well,
that's one idea.
It's not a bad idea. The other night I was watching episode of The West Wing while I was cooking dinner. And it's the one from season 1 or 2 where they're trying to nominate someone at the Supreme Court, right? Scott will probably remember the name of the episode, but regardless, they've vetted this guy. They are ready to announce it, and then they find out something about them. And I thought about this same situation because there's not the same level of vetting that occurs at the state level, right? And I get that there are a ton of boards and commissions, and you don't have the resources to vet everybody, and maybe that's legitimate. But it just seemed ironic that the speaker's office was like, "Oh man, well
I would have thought that she told me that her favorite nephew was one of the founders of Epic Charting. It seems like we trust these people, and then we just find this out on Facebook,
right?" Right.
I mean, but you know what? But we can't be expanding Medicaid because then people are going to try and get that free healthcare. I mean, it's just.
But I will say that I am appreciative of this collaborative effort among state officials and statewide officials in attacking this problem and really getting to the root of it, because sometimes people get stuck into an ideological viewpoint of, oh, we need choice, but this is a different situation where there's a possible abuse and misuse of our public dollars that we're hoping should be used for our public school system and bettering our children, right? And so this is a really awesome moment in governance where we see the state auditor, we see the state superintendent, and we're even seeing the attorney general's office intervene to stop any kind of abuses of this nature.
Yeah, I mean, this could be the. I don't think this is the end of the story. I mean, AG Hunter's has appointed a special counsel to kind of review
Melissa
the findings.
Houston.
Yeah, to review the findings of the audit, and then I'm curious to see if if she turns up anything else, it wouldn't shock me if she did. There's this is a story that's not. There's a lot of people have been kind of making casting aspersions, if you will, on Epic for a while, and I think that this is they've found something they're going to grab onto, and I don't think this is going away.
Yeah, and to be clear, the legislature, Senator Sharp, I think, right, had said, like, there's some stuff going down that's not okay.
He took the sword for this moment to happen.
Like, yeah, and they sued him, right? Like, and which the old adage of...
And lost, by the way.
That's right. But, the old adage of methinks thou dost protest too much, like, seemed to be the case in the beginning, where he was like, hey, I think they're doing bad stuff. And they were like, we sue you. And it's like, why don't you just say no? And, like, I'll let them come in. Like, if you're not worried about it, what's the big deal? Clearly they're worried about it. Clearly this is why.
Well, Andy, I think this is the most important time for the investigation to happen, because we're in the middle of a pandemic and there's so much what word do I want to use? There's a lot of complications in the public school system right now, right? And so many parents are trying to figure out what their options are going to be for their children. And we may see an expansion of school choice options for children, because parents are looking for virtual options for their kids. And many parents have turned to Epic because they're the most known in the state, right? And so it's really important now that the legislature get a handle on adequate regulation around school choice to ensure that we're not seeing further abuses in the future, and to make sure that our dollars are being spent in the way they're supposed to be to help kids.
Yeah, that's exactly right. All right. Well, on that note, I think we should end on that note. Also, just as an aside, I recommend listeners you go read the non-doc article about Mike Christian and Mickey Dolenz that are running for that seat. Both of those men have held that seat previously. Dolenz, of course, is the incumbent. But there's some really great retail politics stories in there. Mickey Dolenz helped a woman catch a possum at her house while he was out knocking doors. It's really salt of the earth. These guys trying to run for election in an important House district and really caring about their constituents. Scott and Bailey, thank you both for being here today.
Wouldn't miss for the world.
Thank you, Andy.
Listeners, please don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast if you haven't already. If you have, thank you very much. Reminder that tomorrow, October 17th, if you haven't listened to this before 10 a.m. on the 17th, we will be hosting our first virtual Civic Saturday gathering. Tomorrow, it'll be on our Facebook and our YouTube channels. Even if you listen to this afterwards, go back and watch it. The video will be there. It'll be an hour long. Chris Weiser of Sugar Free All-Stars will be doing the music for us. Scott and I will be there. And some of our other colleagues from Generation Citizen. It should be a great event. We will have more in the future as well. Let's Pod This is a production of Let's Fix This. It's produced by Scott, Bailey, and me. We are a member of the Mostly Harmless Media Network. And our theme music is a song called Rhino Funk by artist So Down. And folks, before I let you go, a reminder that decisions are made by those who show up. Don't forget to show up and vote. If you've already voted this year, thank you. Go tell your friends. Make sure they know to vote too. Have a great week.